He kicked her out like she was worthless, laughed in her face, called her a nobody. But the next day? He was on his knees, begging her for a job. What happened in just 24 hours that turned this powerful CEO into a desperate man? Stay with me, because this story will change the way you see success forever. The towering skyscraper of Harrington Enterprises stood tall in the heart of New York City, its reflective glass windows mirroring the restless pulse of the metropolis. The air outside smelled of rain-dampened asphalt and roasted coffee drifting from a nearby cafe, blending with the occasional honk of impatient taxi drivers. Inside, the atmosphere was pristine, sterile, gleaming marble floors stretched endlessly, and the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne filled the air. This was the kingdom of the rich, the untouchable, the elite. On the topmost floor, past the mahogany-paneled hallways lined with modern art pieces worth millions, sat Richard "Rick" Callaway, the CEO of Harrington Enterprises. He was a man whose name was synonymous with power. At just 45, he had built an empire of luxury hotels, high-end fashion brands, and tech investments. He was a self-made billionaire, respected but feared, admired yet despised. Dressed in an impeccable navy blue Armani suit, Rick Callaway exuded dominance. His dark hair, slicked back with precision, framed a face that rarely showed emotion, except for that ever-present look of condescension. His piercing blue eyes were sharp and calculating, scanning the financial reports laid before him. His assistant, Mark Bennett, a lanky young man in his early 30s, hesitated before speaking. "Sir, we have an unscheduled visitor," Mark announced cautiously. Rick barely lifted his gaze from the report. "I don't do unscheduled," he said coldly, flipping a page. "It's a woman, she insists it's urgent," Mark added, his voice uneasy. Rick sighed in irritation. "Who is she?" Mark hesitated. "She wouldn't say. Just that it's important." Rick scoffed, finally looking up. "Send her in. Let's see what kind of sob story this one's got." Moments later, the glass door swung open, revealing a woman in her mid-30s, Emma Carter. Her long, wavy brown hair was slightly damp from the rain, and her modest beige coat was worn at the edges. She clutched a folder tightly in her hands, her hazel eyes filled with a mixture of determination and nervousness. Rick arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You have 5 minutes." Emma took a deep breath, stepping forward. "Mr. Callaway, I came here because I have a business proposal. It's innovative, cost-effective, and could revolutionize your brand's outreach. I just need a chance to—" Rick held up a hand, cutting her off. "Stop. Let me guess. You're some desperate entrepreneur hoping I'll take pity on you?" He leaned back in his leather chair, smirking. "Lady, do you know how many people walk in here with the same dream? Thinking they have the next big thing? 99% of them are delusional." Emma's cheeks flushed, but she stood her ground. "This isn't just an idea. It's backed by research and—" Rick waved her off. "Listen, sweetheart. If I were interested, I would have already heard about you. That's how business works. You want success? Earn it. Don't come begging." Emma's hands clenched into fists. "I'm not begging. I'm offering you an opportunity." Rick chuckled dryly. "And I'm declining. Now, if you'll excuse me," he pressed a button on his desk. "Mark, have security escort Miss Carter, was it? Out of my office." 2 security guards appeared almost instantly. Emma's eyes burned with frustration, but she refused to let them see her cry. She straightened her shoulders and walked out with her dignity intact. As the glass doors closed behind her, Rick exhaled sharply, shaking his head. People never learn. He had no idea that by tomorrow he would be the one knocking on her door, pleading for a second chance. The morning after his encounter with Emma Carter, Rick Callaway's world was still firmly in his grasp, or so he thought. The sun had barely begun its ascent over New York City, painting the skyline in hues of gold and crimson, when he arrived at Harrington Enterprises, his mind already occupied with stock reports and expansion plans. He strode through the lobby, nodding briefly at the doorman, his polished Oxfords clicking against the marble floor. The scent of fresh espresso lingered in the air, blending with the crisp notes of his expensive cologne. The day, as always, promised efficiency, power, and control. But as soon as he stepped into his private elevator, his phone buzzed. Mark Bennett. Rick answered with a sigh. What now? Sir, Mark's voice was trembling. There's a problem. Rick's brow furrowed. Spit it out. There was a long pause before Mark finally blurted out, the company's bankrupt. Silence. The word echoed in Rick's head, foreign and absurd. Bankrupt? That was impossible. Rick let out a sharp laugh. Mark, if this is some kind of joke. I'm not joking, sir, Mark interrupted, his voice taut with panic. Overnight, our stocks crashed. The board is in an emergency meeting right now. The media's already reporting it. Investors are pulling out. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, but Rick's feet remained planted inside, his grip tightening around his phone. His heart pounded, but he forced his voice to stay calm. How? Why? Mark's next words made the world tilt beneath him. A federal investigation. Fraud allegations. Apparently, someone in finance manipulated reports, but the SEC found discrepancies. They froze our assets, and now we're finished. Rick didn't realize he was moving until he stormed through the glass doors of the conference room. Inside, the board members sat stiffly, their faces ashen, while a news broadcast played on the massive screen behind them. Harrington Enterprises, once a titan in luxury and innovation, is facing immediate collapse following allegations of financial misconduct. CEO Richard Callaway has yet to make a statement, but experts predict this could be the worst corporate downfall of the decade. Rick barely heard the rest. His ears buzzed. His lungs felt tight. We need a strategy, he said, his voice unervingly steady. We need. One of the senior board members, Jonathan Reeves, cut him off with a dry chuckle. A strategy? Rick, wake up. The company is gone. The government froze all assets. We can't even pay our employees. Rick's stomach twisted. His empire, his legacy, was crumbling right before his eyes. What about my personal accounts? Rick asked, his voice a shade quieter. Jonathan sighed, exchanging glances with the others. Investigators seized them too. They're looking into your involvement. Rick staggered back a step. His accounts were frozen? His hands clenched into fists. I had nothing to do with this. We believe you, Jonathan said, though the doubt in his tone was unmistakable. But belief won't save you. Your assets, your homes, your cars, it's all under review. You're not just broke, Rick. You're ruined. The finality of those words crashed over him like a tidal wave. For the first time in 20 years, Rick Callaway, billionaire, powerhouse, untouchable, felt helpless. By midday, the media swarmed his office. By evening, the bank had seized his properties. And by midnight, he stood in the rain outside his penthouse, watching as security escorted him out. His suits, his cars, his connections, gone. Rick Callaway had nothing left. And tomorrow he would have to do the unthinkable. He would have to beg for a job. A fall from grace. The next morning, Rick Callaway woke up in a cheap motel on the outskirts of New York City. The sheets were scratchy, the air smelled of stale cigarettes, and the neon sign outside flickered against the rain-streaked window. He sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, staring at the floor. This can't be real. Just yesterday, he had stood in his penthouse, looking down on the city like a king surveying his empire. Today, he was just another nobody. His phone buzzed, a message from Mark. I don't know if you've seen the news, but they're saying you knew about the fraud. The press is calling you a scam artist. I can't be involved in this. I'm sorry. Rick gritted his teeth. Coward. Mark had been his assistant for 6 years, and now he was jumping ship like everyone else. He scrolled through his notifications. Calls from reporters, angry investors, even former employees demanding answers. But the worst was the bank notification. Account balance, $0. His fists clenched. This isn't happening. Then, another thought hit him like a slap to the face. What now? Where could he go? Who could he turn to? Who would help him? No one. Because he had never helped anyone. Swallowing his pride. By noon, Rick had visited 3 different companies, hoping to leverage his experience. No one would hire him. The SEC investigation is still ongoing, one hiring manager said, barely looking at him. We can't take that risk. Another smirked, shaking his head. A former billionaire asking for a job? That's rich. No pun intended. Doors that had once opened for him without hesitation were now slamming in his face. Rick sat on a park bench, the cold wind biting through his thin jacket. This is what rock bottom feels like. Then, a name popped into his head. Emma Carter. The woman he had humiliated just a day ago. He let out a bitter laugh. There's no way. But desperation makes men do the unthinkable. Rick pulled out his phone and searched her name. After a few minutes of digging, he found an address linked to her small startup. With no other options, he stood up and walked toward the only door he could still knock on. The tables have turned. The office was nothing like his former empire. No marble floors. No glass walls. Just a humble co-working space in a refurbished warehouse, filled with eager young professionals typing away at their laptops. Rick hesitated at the entrance. The humiliation burned in his chest. But he stepped inside. A receptionist looked up. Can I help you? I need to see Emma Carter. The woman eyed him skeptically but nodded. One moment. Minutes later, the door to a small office opened, and Emma stepped out. The moment she saw him, her eyebrows shot up in disbelief. Mr. Calloway? Rick forced himself to meet her gaze. Emma, I need to talk. She folded her arms. Funny. Yesterday, you didn't even let me finish my pitch. I know, he said quickly. I was wrong. The words felt foreign in his mouth. But I need a job. Emma blinked. Excuse me? Rick swallowed his pride. I lost everything. My company. My money. My reputation. And I need a fresh start. I came to you because you were right. You have something valuable and I didn't see it. Emma studied him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. Come in. Rick exhaled and walked into the office of the woman he had dismissed just yesterday. A lesson in humility. Inside, the space was modest but efficient. A desk cluttered with documents, a whiteboard filled with notes and projections. It was clear Emma had built this from the ground up. She sat across from him. Why should I hire you? Rick ran a hand through his hair. Because I know business. I know strategy. I may not have money anymore, but I have experience. Emma leaned back. And why should I help you after how you treated me? Rick hesitated. The old him, the arrogant, untouchable CEO, would have found a way to manipulate the situation. But that man was gone. I don't deserve it, he admitted. But I'm asking anyway. Emma didn't say anything for a long time. Then she sighed. I won't hire you, she said. Rick's stomach sank. But, she continued, I will let you intern for me. His head snapped up. Intern? You need to prove yourself, she said simply. If you're serious, you'll start from the bottom. Just like the rest of us. Rick's pride screamed in protest. An intern? After everything he'd accomplished? But what choice did he have? He exhaled. Fine. When do I start? Emma smirked. Right now. Grab a notebook. And just like that, the once mighty CEO became an intern at a company he had dismissed as worthless. But what he didn't realize was that this job would change his life more than any billion-dollar deal ever had. Weeks passed. The once mighty Rick Calloway was now just another intern, fetching coffee, taking notes, and handling menial tasks at Emma Carter's startup. The humiliation was relentless. Young employees who once would have groveled for his attention now barely acknowledged him. Some even whispered behind his back. That's really him? A programmer murmured one day. The billionaire who lost everything? Another laughed. Damn. That's brutal. Rick heard every word. And every word cut. But he endured. Because, for the first time in his life, he had no choice but to listen. To learn. To grow. Emma's business was nothing like his former empire. She valued people. She focused on innovation over profits, integrity over power. And, despite himself, Rick found himself respecting her. But just as he started feeling like he could rebuild, his past came knocking. The tempting offer. It happened late one evening. Most of the office had emptied, but Rick stayed behind, reviewing financial projections for Emma's company. That's when his phone rang. A number he hadn't seen in weeks. Jonathan Reeves. His former board member. The man who had told him his empire was gone. Rick hesitated, then answered. Jonathan. A smooth chuckle came through the line. I've been trying to reach you. How's life? Rick's grip tightened around the phone. What do you want? Jonathan sighed. Come on, don't be like that. I have an opportunity for you. Rick almost laughed. I don't think I'm in a position to be picky. Exactly, Jonathan said. That's why I'm calling. Look, some investors are looking to revive Harrington Enterprises, under a new name, of course. But they need someone with your expertise. Rick's breath caught. Revive Harrington? His empire? Jonathan continued. They'll take care of the SEC investigations. Wipe your record clean. You'll be CEO again, Rick. Back on top. Rick felt his pulse quicken. This was it. A way back to power. A way back to the world he knew. But then Jonathan's voice turned sharp. One condition. Rick frowned. What is it? Jonathan exhaled. Emma Carter's company. Her model is a threat to our plans. If you join us, we need you to shut her down. Rick froze. He stared at the papers on Emma's desk. The plans she had spent years developing. The vision she had fought for. And he thought back to that moment in his office. The way he had humiliated her. The way she had still given him a second chance. Now he was being asked to betray her. I'll give you 24 hours, Jonathan said smoothly. Think about it. The line went dead. Rick lowered the phone. His hands were shaking. That night, Rick barely slept. He paced in his tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, weighing the options. If he said yes, he would regain everything he had lost. His wealth. His influence. His place among the elite. If he said no, he would remain here. A nobody. Starting from the ground up. But then another thought crept in. Who had he been when he was at the top? A man who crushed people like Emma without a second thought. A man who had everything but had valued nothing. And yet, Emma had given him a chance when no one else would. She had given him dignity when the world had stripped him of it. Rick inhaled sharply. The answer was clear. But he knew Jonathan wouldn't take no for an answer. Facing the consequences. The next morning, Rick entered the office with a decision set in stone. Emma was reviewing proposals when he walked up. She looked up. Rick? Something wrong? He hesitated, just for a moment. Then he said it. Emma, I have to tell you something. She set her pen down. Okay. Rick told her everything. About Jonathan. About the investors. About the offer to reclaim his power, at the cost of destroying her. Emma's face darkened. And what did you say? Rick exhaled. I'm saying no. For the first time, Emma looked genuinely surprised. You're turning down everything? She asked. Your old life? Rick nodded. Because I don't want to be that man again. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Emma did something he didn't expect. She smiled. You really have changed, she murmured. Rick let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But then, the office doors burst open. Two men in dark suits stormed in. And behind them, Jonathan Reeves. Emma shot to her feet. What the hell is this? Jonathan's smirk was ice cold. You really thought we'd let you walk away, Rick? He glanced at Emma. Or let you keep running this little business? Rick stepped in front of her. I said no, Jonathan. Jonathan's eyes gleamed. Then you leave me no choice. He turned to the men. Shut them down. The men moved toward the desks, shoving computers to the floor, scattering papers. Employees screamed. Someone called security. Rick's blood boiled. Not this time. With a burst of rage, he grabbed Jonathan by the collar and shoved him against the wall. Enough! Rick's voice thundered. Jonathan gasped, eyes wide. He had never seen Rick like this before. No one had. This company isn't yours to take, Rick growled. And neither is my future. Jonathan sneered. You can't stop this. Rick's grip tightened. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket and held it up. The screen was recording. Jonathan's face paled. I just sent this to every news outlet in the city, Rick said coldly. Congratulations. You just confessed to corporate sabotage and blackmail. Jonathan's mouth opened, then closed. Get out. Rick's voice was deadly calm. Jonathan wrenched himself free, his expression dark with fury. You just made a powerful enemy. Rick smirked. Good. I could use the challenge. Jonathan turned and stormed out, his goons following. The moment they were gone, Rick turned to Emma. She was staring at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with respect. Not bad, Calloway, she said. Rick let out a breath, then smiled for the first time in weeks. For the first time in his life, he had chosen the right side. And it felt better than being on top ever had. The office was in chaos. Employees scrambled to pick up scattered papers, broken equipment littered the floor, and hushed whispers of shock filled the air. The attack had been sudden, violent, but it was over. Rick Calloway stood in the center of it all, his heart still pounding. He had made his choice. And there was no going back. Emma turned to him, arms crossed. You really sent that recording to the press? Rick nodded, pulling up his phone. It's already making headlines. Emma's gaze softened. You know Jonathan's not going to let this go, right? Rick exhaled. Let him come. His voice was steady. For once in my life, I fought for something that actually mattered. She studied him for a long moment, then gave him a small nod. Good. At that moment, an employee called out, Emma, you need to see this. Everyone huddled around a computer screen. The news was already spreading. Ex-billionaire Rick Calloway exposes corporate corruption. Headlines flashed across multiple platforms. Social media buzzed with reactions. People who had once mocked Rick were now calling him brave for standing up to corruption. Jonathan's associates were scrambling, disassociating themselves from the scandal. And most importantly, Emma's company was now in the spotlight. Investors, customers, and supporters flooded the company's inbox with messages of encouragement. Emma turned to Rick, stunned. You just put us on the map. Rick smiled. You deserve to be there all along. Later that evening, Rick sat in Emma's office, the adrenaline finally wearing off. Emma sat across from him. So, what now? Rick let out a tired chuckle. That's the big question, isn't it? Emma smirked. You could stay here, you know. Rick raised an eyebrow. As an intern? Emma rolled her eyes. No. As a partner. Rick blinked. He had expected Emma to thank him, maybe even be a little grateful. But, an offer like this? Emma leaned forward. You have experience, connections, and now, integrity. She smirked. Sort of. Rick shook his head in disbelief. You're serious? Emma shrugged. I could use someone who's been to the top and knows what not to do. Rick exhaled, leaning back in his chair. A few weeks ago, he would have laughed at the idea of working in a startup like this. But now, he looked around the office, the employees working late, motivated by something greater than just money. He thought of how he felt standing up to Jonathan, fighting for something real. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. A slow smile spread across his face. All right, Carter. Let's build something that actually matters. Emma grinned. Now you're getting it. Rick Calloway had lost everything. And somehow, that had been the best thing that ever happened to him. 1 year later, Rick Calloway stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of Carter and Calloway Innovations, staring out at the city skyline. It wasn't the view from his old penthouse. It wasn't a towering empire built on ruthless ambition. But it was his. And this time he had earned it the right way. After the public takedown of Jonathan Reeves, investors flocked to Emma's company, eager to support a business that stood for integrity, sustainability, and people-first leadership. Rick had officially become Emma's partner, not just on paper, but in vision. He used his knowledge of corporate strategy to help scale the company while ensuring they never lost sight of their values. And Jonathan Reeves? Lawsuits and regulatory investigations crushed his influence, forcing him into obscurity. The man who once dictated the business world's rules was now just another fallen titan. Rick had once feared that fate for himself. But he realized that losing everything had been the best thing that ever happened to him. Personal growth and reflection. As Rick gazed out the window, Emma entered, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. Still not tired of this view? Rick chuckled. It reminds me how far I've come. Emma leaned against the desk. So, any regrets? Rick thought about it. The billions he lost. The power he once wielded. The ruthless, cutthroat reputation that had defined him for years. He shook his head. None of it had ever really made him happy. I used to think success was about being untouchable, he admitted. About standing at the top and making sure no one could bring me down. Emma smirked. Yeah, you were kind of a jerk. Rick laughed. That's putting it mildly. He took a sip of his coffee, his expression growing thoughtful. But real success? It's about building something that lasts. Helping people rise with you instead of stepping on them to get higher. Emma nodded. Now that's a definition I can get behind. Rick smiled, feeling a deep, unshakable sense of peace. For years, he had chased a dream that had left him empty. Now, he had less money, less power, but more purpose than ever before. And that was true wealth. Rick turned back to the window, looking at the city bustling below. How many people were still caught in the same illusion he had been? How many thought power meant worth, and that kindness was a weakness? He had learned the hard way that true strength isn't in how many people you control. It's in how many people you uplift. Turning to Emma, he grinned. Let's keep changing the game, Carter. Emma raised her coffee cup in a toast. To success, the right way. They clinked their cups together. The ruthless billionaire was gone. And in his place stood a man who finally understood what really mattered. Backhand index pointing right power without purpose is meaningless. True success comes from integrity, growth, and lifting others along the way. What about you? Have you ever chased something you thought would make you happy, only to realize you were searching in the wrong place? Maybe it's time to redefine what success means for you. Because in the end, who you become matters far more than what you achieve. What will you choose?